There is a line in the official record that reads simply, "Without ceremony, extinct." The eastern cougar, the animal that once moved through every ridge and hollow of the Appalachian Range from Georgia to Maine, was declared gone by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service in 2011 and formally removed from the endangered species list in 2018, not because it had recovered, but because the government had concluded, after decades of review, that it no longer existed and had not for generations. The last confirmed wild cougar in the eastern United States outside of Florida was killed near the Maine-Quebec border in 1938. After that, the official record goes quiet, and it stays quiet for the better part of a century. But the mountains never fully agreed with the paperwork. Across the ridgelines of Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, West Virginia, and North Carolina, the stories never stopped, even after the animal itself was supposed to have a shape crossing a logging road at dusk, a scream in the hollow that people swore was no bobcat and no fox, a track pressed into mud beside a creek, too wide, too round, missing the claw marks a dog or coyote print would show. Wildlife agencies filed these reports where they file such things, under unconfirmed, alongside the stories that turn out, on closer inspection, to be a large house cat, a stray dog, or simply a trick of shadow and scale in low light. That skepticism was earned honestly. For most of the 20th century, nearly every reported cougar in the eastern mountains turned out to be something else entirely. And yet the reports kept coming, decade after decade, thick enough in places that whole communities kept the cougar alive as a kind of folk fact, long after wildlife biologists had filed it away as myth. The panther, the painter, in the old mountain dialect, the thing someone's grandfather swore he saw crossing the ridge above the home place, more than once, over more than one season. Before we go further, if this is the kind of story that stays with you after dark, go ahead and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because the map of where people report seeing these animals is stranger than you'd expect. Here is what changed the equation, slowly, and then not so slowly. Beginning in the 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s, confirmed cougar sightings began climbing steadily west of the Mississippi, driven by a well-documented biological phenomenon. Young male cougars, upon reaching independence, cannot remain in the territory where they were born. Established resident males will not tolerate a rival, so the young male leaves, walking for months at a stretch, covering ground a few miles most nights, searching for unclaimed territory and an available mate. There is no built-in limit to that instinct. A male will keep moving as long as the land ahead remains empty of his own kind. In a landscape swept largely clear of cougars, east of the breeding populations in the Dakotas and the northern Great Plains, that instinct can carry an animal a very long way. The proof arrived unmistakably in 2011, the same year the species was declared extinct in the east. A young male cougar was struck and killed by a vehicle on a parkway in Connecticut, more than 1,000 miles from the nearest confirmed breeding population. DNA testing traced the animal directly back to the Black Hills of South Dakota, and its actual travel route, reconstructed from genetic samples recovered along the way, suggested a journey of well over 1,000 miles, in a straight line and considerably farther on the ground. One of the longest dispersal treks ever documented for the species. The animal showed no sign of captivity. It was wild, and it had walked essentially the entire width of the country. That single case rewrote the assumption that had governed eastern wildlife management for generations. If a lone male could walk that far east, individual cougars could plausibly reach anywhere in the eastern United States, including the ridgelines of Appalachia, without ever representing an established breeding population. A wandering male, however far he traveled, could explain a track, a photograph, even an occasional roadkill. What he could not explain on his own was a family. That distinction is the entire hinge of this story, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the reason biologists have spent years being careful, almost stubborn, about what they will and will not confirm. Female cougars do not disperse the way males do. Where a young male walks until the land runs out or he finds a mate, a young female tends to stay close to home. Biologists refer to this tendency as philopatry, and the pattern holds with remarkable consistency across the species range. Roughly half of all female cougars never leave their birth territory at all, and those that do typically settle within a modest distance of it, nothing resembling the 1,000-mile treks recorded for dispersing males. The longest dispersal distance ever documented for a female cougar in North America is a small fraction of the distance recorded for the Connecticut male, and even that shorter distance was treated by researchers at the time as an unusually long journey for the sex. That difference is not a minor technical detail. It is the wall standing between a landscape with wandering male cougars passing through it, and a landscape with an actual breeding, self-sustaining population of cougars living in it. A population needs females. Without them, every confirmed male sighting east of the established breeding range is, biologically speaking, a dead end, a single set of footprints heading nowhere, incapable of producing a second generation, no matter how many individual males make the crossing. For years, that wall appeared to hold in Appalachia specifically confirmed evidence, meaning clear photographs, tracks verified by trained biologists, or DNA recovered from hair, scat, or a carcass, remained sparse and scattered across the region, mostly consistent with the occasional dispersing male passing through rather than any settled population. State wildlife agencies across the Appalachian states maintained, publicly and consistently, that there was no verified evidence of a breeding cougar population anywhere in their territory, even as reports from residents continued arriving by the hundreds every year, the overwhelming majority of them ultimately attributed to bobcats, dogs, or other more common animals upon investigation. But the reports never fully stopped, and in certain counties, they never thinned out either. Trail camera use exploded across the rural South and Central Appalachia through the 2010s and into the 2020s, driven initially by hunters monitoring deer activity, and the sheer volume of new imagery being generated, much of it never formally reviewed by any wildlife agency, created a quiet possibility that unsettled some biologists more than it comforted them. If a resident population existed at low density in the most remote, least camera-dense parts of the range, the absence of confirmed evidence might reflect the absence of enough eyes looking, rather than the absence of the animal itself. That is the position Appalachia has occupied for the better part of 2 decades now. Not confirmed and not dismissed. A gap in the record that the terrain itself seems built to protect. Dense forest canopy, steep and largely roadless terrain across huge stretches of the central Appalachians, and a rural human population accustomed enough to strange tracks and distant screams in the night that many simply stopped reporting them at all, having learned that the report rarely changed anything. What makes the current moment different, according to researchers who have watched this pattern for years, is the growing frequency of a very specific kind of report, one that echoes almost exactly what eventually forced Michigan's Wildlife Agency to change its own official language after a 2025 trail camera photograph confirmed a female cougar traveling with 2 cubs in the Upper Peninsula, the first documented cougar reproduction east of the Mississippi River in over a century. In isolated pockets of central Appalachia, wildlife biologists and university researchers have logged a slowly accumulating handful of trail camera images and eyewitness reports describing not a single animal passing through, but multiple animals together, moving as a group, in patterns consistent with a mother and young, rather than a lone disperser. None of these reports have yet cleared the same bar Michigan's did. No DNA sample has yet confirmed a resident, breeding female anywhere in the Appalachian Range, and the researchers who study the species are careful, almost insistent, about not overstating what a handful of ambiguous images can prove. A group of animals moving together in low light, at a distance, through dense cover, is exactly the kind of image that has fooled observers for 100 years. But the caution itself has shifted in tone. Biologists who once dismissed nearly every eastern cougar report as a case of mistaken identity now describe the Appalachian Range differently, as a landscape where the presence of individual, confirmed male cougars is no longer seriously disputed, only their permanence and the possibility of females among them. The same demographic mathematics that eventually forced Michigan and Minnesota to acknowledge reproduction on their own soil, wandering males arriving steadily for over a decade, occasional unexplained clusters of repeated sightings at the same coordinates, and a slowly rising baseline of confirmed evidence are visible in fragments across the Appalachian data as well, just without the single decisive photograph that settled the question further north. If a similar population is quietly establishing itself in the Appalachians, the implications extend well past the animal itself. Cougars are effective, direct regulators of deer populations, and the eastern half of the country currently carries a deer population significantly beyond what the available forest habitat can comfortably sustain without predators, a condition tied directly to elevated rates of deer vehicle collisions across rural highways every single year. Researchers modeling a hypothetical return of cougars to the eastern United States have estimated that a restored, functioning predator population could meaningfully reduce deer numbers over a period of decades, with measurable downstream effects on both roadway safety and forest regeneration, benefits that would accrue quietly over years, largely invisible to anyone not specifically tracking the data. For now, the cougar remains protected under state law across virtually every Appalachian state, where reports persist, illegal to kill and, in most jurisdictions, illegal even to actively pursue or harass, a protective status assigned specifically because a female under sustained human pressure will abandon a den. And the very population researchers are trying to confirm exists is the one most easily destroyed by the attention that confirmation would bring. So the search continues at a careful distance, trail cameras left running for months at a time in the most remote hollows biologists can reach, DNA labs waiting on samples that arrive slowly and unpredictably, and a regional wildlife agency posture that has shifted over roughly 15 years, from flat denial to something closer to watchful uncertainty. What is known, stated plainly, is limited but no longer negligible. Individual confirmed cougars have appeared across the Appalachian Range with increasing, documented frequency since the early 2000s. No jurisdiction in the region has yet confirmed a breeding female, and in the most remote, least monitored corners of that same range, exactly the kind of country a resident population would need in order to remain unseen for as long as this one arguably already has. The trail cameras keep running. The reports keep arriving from residents who have stopped expecting anyone to believe them, and the mountains, as they have for 100 years, keep their own record and give it up slowly, and only when they choose to. To understand why the Appalachian Range in particular might be capable of hiding a population for this long, it helps to actually stand inside the geography rather than simply look at it on a map. The Central Appalachians are not a single ridge, but a folded, overlapping system of ridges and hollows running for hundreds of miles, much of it covered in second and third growth hardwood forest that has, in places, been left largely undisturbed for the better part of a century. Large stretches of eastern Kentucky, southern West Virginia, western Virginia, and the Cherokee and Pisgah National Forest lands of North Carolina and Tennessee remain genuinely roadless at the scale that matters to a large, wide-ranging predator, meaning a cougar could realistically cross a dozen miles of forest interior without ever needing to touch pavement, a fence line, or a lit structure. That kind of terrain does something specific to wildlife visibility that flat, open country does not. A cougar moving through open rangeland in the American West is regularly caught on camera, simply because ranchers, hunters and researchers blanket that kind of terrain with trail cameras set along fence lines and water sources, the natural bottlenecks any animal moving through open country is forced to use. Appalachian terrain offers no equivalent bottleneck. Water is everywhere, in every hollow, along every ridgeline, in a landscape that receives far more annual rainfall than the arid West. An animal moving through it has no reason to funnel itself past any particular point a camera might be watching. It can simply keep to the timber, cross a ridge, drop into the next hollow, and never once cross the same ground twice in a season. This is part of why wildlife agencies across the region have historically treated the absence of confirmed evidence with more caution than agencies in more open western states typically apply. An absence of confirmed sightings in Wyoming's sagebrush flats is reasonably strong evidence of an actual absence of animals, because the terrain itself makes concealment difficult. The same absence of confirmed sightings in a hollow of eastern Kentucky proves comparatively little, because the terrain there is built, almost by accident of geology, to make concealment easy. Longtime residents of the region have understood this instinctively for generations, long before any biologist formalized it into a research paper. Hunting families across Appalachia have passed down stories of the panther for well over 100 years, describing not a single anomalous sighting, but a recurring generational presence. Grandparents telling grandchildren about the same kind of scream in the same hollow, decades apart, often in families that had no contact with each other and no reason to coordinate their stories. Folklorists who have collected these accounts note the striking consistency of certain details across unrelated families and unrelated counties. The scream in particular, described again and again as sounding disturbingly close to a human woman in distress, a detail that happens to match documented cougar vocalizations recorded in the confirmed western range of the species with unsettling precision. None of that folklore constitutes evidence in the way a wildlife biologist would define the term, and researchers are careful to say so directly. A consistent story passed down across generations can reflect an animal that was genuinely present the entire time, or it can reflect a cultural narrative that simply persists on its own, independent of whether the animal behind it was ever really there in any given decade. Separating those two possibilities from folklore alone is, by design, impossible. It is exactly why the current generation of researchers has leaned so heavily on trail cameras, DNA analysis, and verified roadkill recoveries rather than eyewitness accounts, however numerous or however consistent those accounts might be across unrelated sources. What has changed the calculation in the last several years is not the folklore, which has always been there, but the sheer volume of new photographic data being generated across the region, almost by accident. Hunters running trail cameras to pattern deer activity ahead of archery season now generate millions of images annually across the Appalachian states combined. The overwhelming majority of them never formally submitted to any state wildlife agency for review, simply stored on memory cards, glanced at once, and often deleted or overwritten within a season. Wildlife agencies in states including Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia have all, at various points, put out public calls asking residents to submit any images they believe show a cougar, an acknowledgement implicit in the request itself that the agencies understand there is almost certainly more photographic evidence circulating privately across the region than has ever reached an official desk for review. This creates the same structural possibility that eventually reshaped the official record in Michigan and Minnesota. It is entirely possible that the animals have been present, and in some pockets even reproducing, below the threshold of anyone's formal ability to notice, not because the evidence does not exist, but because the evidence exists scattered across thousands of private memory cards and phone galleries, rather than concentrated anywhere a biologist would think to look. What looks, from the outside, like a population slowly arriving in real time, may in some of these counties actually be a population slowly being discovered, its presence finally catching up to the volume of cameras now capable of recording it. The third possibility, the one most quickly raised and most quickly set aside by researchers who have investigated it directly, is that individual Appalachian sightings represent escaped or deliberately released captive cougars rather than wild dispersing animals. Private ownership of large exotic cats has a documented history across parts of rural Appalachia, and wildlife officials do not dismiss the possibility outright for any single report. But the physical evidence recovered from confirmed cases across the broader eastern range, including DNA from the animal killed in Connecticut and from several roadkill and hunter-harvest specimens recovered across the Midwest and South in recent years, has consistently traced back to wild western source populations, the Black Hills and the northern Great Plains chief among them, with no indication of captive origin in isotope or genetic testing. Every confirmed case investigated closely enough to test has so far come back the same way: wild and western. What the researchers who study this region will tell you plainly, if you ask them directly, rather than pushing them toward a more dramatic answer, is what they do not yet know. They do not know how many individual cougars are currently moving through the Appalachian Range in any given year. There is no population estimate for the region, and the biologists closest to the data are notably resistant to inventing one, having watched exaggerated numbers do real damage to public trust in wildlife management elsewhere in the country. They do not know with certainty whether any of the animals currently being photographed are settling into fixed home ranges or continuing to pass through toward some other, more distant destination. And they do not know, not yet, whether any female is currently denning anywhere in the region, though a small but real number of researchers now say, carefully and always followed by a qualifier, that they would not be especially surprised if she already is. For the people who live across these counties, day to day, the uncertainty rarely announces itself as anything dramatic. It shows up instead as a particular kind of quiet caution that longtime residents describe almost without thinking about it. The porch light left on a little longer before letting the dog out at night. The extra glance toward the tree line while walking a logging road at dusk. A habit inherited from parents and grandparents who could not have said with certainty either, decade after decade, exactly what was or was not out there, watching the same tree line from the other side. There is a reason this particular animal, more than almost any other returning predator story in the eastern United States, holds people's attention the way it does. It is not a story about an exotic invader arriving from somewhere else, the way the python story in Florida plays out, or a story about an animal simply expanding a range it already firmly held, the way the alligators does. It is a story about an animal the region itself declared, formally and on paper, to be gone, only to keep finding its tracks in the mud along the same creeks its grandparents' generation once swore they heard it in. Extinction as a word is supposed to be final. Appalachia's cougar record suggests that in country folded deep and wet and largely unwatched enough, the word can end up meaning something closer to unconfirmed, stretched out patiently across 100 years, waiting on exactly the kind of photograph that finally changed the record further north. Nobody currently studying the region will say the population is confirmed, and increasingly, fewer of them are willing to say, without hesitation, that it definitely is not. That gap between those two sentences is where this story actually lives, and it is worth sitting inside it for a moment before closing. It is not a gap filled with certainty in either direction, and it is not, despite how it might read on the page, a gap filled with fear. It is filled instead with the particular kind of patience the mountains themselves seem to specialize in. Ridge after ridge of forest that has already outlasted the logging booms, the mining towns, and several generations of official pronouncements about what does and does not live within it. The trail cameras will keep running through another winter, then another. Somewhere in a lab, a handful of hair or scat samples collected from a remote hollow will eventually come back from sequencing, and on an ordinary afternoon, with no fanfare attached to it at all, a single genetic marker may finally do for Appalachia what one photograph in the snow already did for Michigan. Until then, the animal remains exactly where it has been for 100 years, somewhere between the official record and the story a grandparent still tells, Moving through the same folded, wet, largely unwatched country, it has apparently never entirely left.